Good evening, everybody. My name's Gary Dunnett from the National Parks Association. I'd just like to welcome everybody to tonight's webinar. Begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on various Aboriginal lands and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Tonight, we're having the first of 3 webinars that BirdLife Australia has very kindly agreed to provide to us. Tonight's seminar is going to be by Candice Larkin, and Candice is going to give us an overview of their Woodland Birds Program. I've got to say, the thing that I personally find most exciting about this is that so much of our work in NPA ends up focusing on the coasts and forests, and the western 2/3, 3/4 of the state often gets a much less of a look in. So it's really nice to have an opportunity to focus in detail on some of those conservation values of our woodland systems. Just a couple of little bits of procedural things. Because we're using the webinar functionality, you won't be able to ask questions directly, but there's 2 things that you can do so that we can respond to any comments and questions. One is that if you just hover your mouse over the bottom bar of your screen, you'll see that there's an icon called chat. If you have any comments that you want to make, so not so much questions, but rather observations, please use the chat function. If you have issues that you'd like us to pick up at the end of the seminar, at the end of the presentation, if you continue along the bottom, you'll see one called Q&A. And if you could just type your question into that, we'll make sure that we'll have an opportunity at the end of tonight's presentation to go through any questions that people might have. And it's always good to see that there's already a number 1 there. So that tells me there's at least 1 question, unless it's just Sam telling everyone this is where the Q&A is. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to pass over to Candice to talk to us about BirdLife Australia's Woodland Birds Program. Thanks, Candice.
Thanks, Gary. Hi, guys. My name is Candice Larkin. I am a New South Wales Woodland Bird Project Officer for BirdLife Australia. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging from the land that I'm calling in, which is the Wabakal country. I'm going to talk to you tonight about our Woodland Birds Program, a bit about BirdLife and a bit about the Woodland Birds CAP. And then I'm just going to touch on some of the projects that I've been involved in and that BirdLife is currently doing in New South Wales. Okay, so just a bit about who we are as an organisation. We're the largest member-based, not-for-profit bird conservation organisation in Australia. We were established in 2012 through the merging of Birds Australia, which has been in Australia since 1901, and a Bird Observation and Conservation Australia group. So both of these groups merged together in 2012, and we currently have 12,500 members and over 120,000 supporters nationwide. BirdLife, we like to work through a variety of different methods, which include research into conservation, advocacy and education. And we work with a lot of different stakeholders. A lot of our work is collaborative. So that means we require both volunteer participation, assistance from government organisations and universities. So we have over 50 staff around the country, and most of our staff are researchers. Prior to working at BirdLife, I was a zoologist. My role in BirdLife still involves a lot of field science and ecology, as well as delivering workshops such as these. And our programs can be broken down into broad ecological areas. So we do a lot of work with coastal birds. These are your beach nesting birds, migratory shorebirds, wetland birds such as the Australasian bittern. We do a lot of monitoring. We have our own app, which I encourage everybody to go and have a look at, called Bird Data. It's free and it allows you to, if you're out on a bushwalk, you can log all of your sightings. It's really user friendly, and it also just feeds back into this bird data portal where we are able to keep a record of all birds. So even if you see a crested pigeon and you want to log it, you're welcome to check out that app. We also have a preventing extinctions team, and of course the last team that I work in, which is Woodland Birds. Okay, so there are many threats that are facing woodland birds. This is probably not news to anybody who is attending here. Of course, the biggest threat is arguably human disturbance, and this can occur in a lot of ways. We have human disturbance in that we're doing a lot of clearing, both in the agricultural sense, but also for development and logging. We also have human interference where we have inappropriate fire regimes. So we're burning at ways that aren't necessarily best for the environment. Obviously, we have grazing, which is an issue, and it leads into another image on this slide. When we have intensive grazing and intensive clearing, we get either invasive predators like the fox here. Otherwise, we can get birds like the native noisy miner that are proliferating due to human disturbance. And I'd just like to flag, since European settlement, we've lost approximately 75% of our native or our historical rainforests and nearly 50% of all forests. And probably the one that I'm going to talk about tonight, in New South Wales, we've lost over 90% of our temperate woodlands. So that means that the birds that we have left, they're operating within 10% of their historical range. And that is why we are seeing some really serious declines. So what I'm going to talk to you tonight about is the Temperate Woodland Bird CAP. Now, what this CAP is it's BirdLife's approach to trying to conserve as many different bird species as we can in the temperate woodland system. And what we've done is we've established 10 focal groups, and by protecting these 10 focal groups, we can hopefully protect most of our woodland bird diversity. So the purpose is obviously a comprehensive conservation plan for temperate woodlands and open forest dependent birds of Southeast Australia. And our approach is to engage in partnerships to adopt a strategy that plays to the relative strengths of all participating stakeholders. So in a few slides, I'll get to the fact that we established 10 key points, and BirdLife is physically undertaking 5 of those themselves, where there are other ones where they're heavily dependent on research. Often what happens is that universities are collaborating with us to step up on the research front, and then we're managing these populations together. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, but it's this beige area is the bioregions comprising the Temperate Woodland Bird CAP project area. So you can see they extend from Queensland all the way through to South Australia, and they include Tasmania. So we defined temperate woodland as woodland that had less than 70% canopy cover, excluding mallee. And all of the birds that we'll talk about today fall into 51 key species that most of their habitat is exclusively made up from these temperate woodlands. So we had 51 threatened or declining birds that were found within this highlighted region. And from that list, we were able to arrive at 10 target groups that we found across the temperate woodland system. And they were ground foragers, pouncing robins, shrubby understory specialists, bark and foliage gleaners, nectar sippers, hollow-dependent parrots, arboreal insectivores, mistletoe specialists, seed-eating parrots, and of course, my favourite, the nocturnal carnivores. I'll just make sure. Okay, so the first of our scope targets was the ground foragers, and the key flagship species that we selected was the bushstone curlew. It is important to note that the flagship species in this context aren't actually the only species that will be getting conservation output, and they're not there. If we were to see an improvement in their numbers, it would not necessarily be indicative of the other birds within that category. The reason we selected these birds is because by picking a flagship species, you're able to hone in people's engagement on that bird. And if they're engaging with that bird, they might be interested in ground forages in general, and we'll look at things that can improve for this bird may also help with other birds. So a general description, these are your ground foraging insectivores. They're reliant on ground level substrate. And while they are generally sedentary, they can be dispersive when food is scarce. Obviously, their key threats is loss of connectivity within the environment. Obviously, if they're on the ground a lot of the time trying to move around, they can be at risk from predation from foxes, cats, dogs. Also, removing of that ground layer gives them less to forage on, and we see declines there as well. So other species you might be familiar with are your button quail, your diamond firetails, apostle birds, and southeastern southern whitefaces as well. Our second target is our pouncing robins. Again, these are insectivores, but these guys forage from low to mid-level stratas. This means that they're sort of occupying a slightly different niche, and they often perch and then pounce on prey, and that's what you often see with these guys. Obviously, there is some movement and post-breeding dispersal, but they're mostly sedentary as well. Very similar key threats to this species as well. So fragmentation in the landscape is isolating their populations, and overgrazing by stock, reducing that ground layer, gives them less, less habitat to hunt and forage on these insects. And the key flagship species is the eastern scarlet robin. Okay, our third group is our shrubby understory specialists. Our key flagship species here is the speckled warbler, another insectivore, and it's highly dependent on complex understory. You'll often see these, in your acacias, in your prickly bushes. I've even seen these guys in blackberry, but I'm not condoning having large amounts of blackberry around. These guys are largely sedentary as well, and they're seasonally migrants in some areas, the black-eared cuckoo, for example. So removal of shrubs, also overgrazing, even things like goats, overgrazing the habitat that they need, and remove, very similar to the last two, removal of habitat connection. Okay, our fourth group is the bark and foliage gleaners. Our flagship species is the brown tree creeper. You may see these guys and white tree creepers quite a bit. Obviously, brown tree creepers are threatened and declining. And these guys are bark and foliage gleaning insectivores. They forage in all the trees and shrub layers, and they're largely sedentary as well. Same threats for these guys as well as with the other birds. And there's quite a few gleaners, particularly in the winter months. You can actually see a lot of these gleaners in mixed flocks together. So you might see, some satellas, some brown tree creepers, other spotted pardalotes, all, moving through a system together. Okay. A lot of you are probably familiar with this bird. So another key group that we often hear a lot about, which is our nectar sippers, and of course the Regent Honeyeater is our flagship species for this group. It's a very tricky bird because, as with most nectar sippers, they're highly nomadic. So what that means is these birds are constantly moving around in the landscape looking for nectar resources to take up. And so a lot of lorikeets, obviously like the little lorikeet, which is also a threatened species, a lot of these birds are constantly moving around in the environment, which means while you might not see them in one area at one time, they might be back in 2 years' time if flowering conditions are right. So the key issue for these guys is often clearing and fragmentation, nest predation by birds such as pied currawongs, They also get excluded by other more competitive honeyeaters, such as the noisy miner. And there's potential for threats from feral honeybees, which at the moment is probably quite concerning. And with reduced habitat is reduced flowering reliability, particularly in the drought. We saw up in northern New South Wales, there was not a lot of flowering going on for several years. So these birds were really struggling in that time. And that's why it's important, if you can, leave the mistletoe in the trees, because that's another flowering resource that these birds can access. But that's a conversation we can get to later. Another species, target species was the swift parrot, another one of the Woodland Bird team's primary birds that we spend a lot of time on. Hollow dependent parrots. These guys rely on large hollow bearing trees. These are obviously very old and mature trees. So a huge risk for these guys is habitat loss from land clearing. Obviously, even when we're replanting, these new trees won't be accessible to these birds for up to 100 years. So they also are nectivorous, and there's often a lot of competition, particularly for smaller lorikeets. They're now competing with large cockatoos for the same resources. Okay, and then we have the arboreal insectivore specialists. So these guys are our flagship species is the 40-spotted pardalote. This species is only found in Tasmania, and they, again, habitat loss is a huge issue for them. A lot of tree dieback. We are also experiencing tree dieback in New South Wales, and some of that may be linked to increased occurrence of noisy miners. Predation from feral species, and again, being outcompeted by aggressive native birds. Okay. Then we have the mistletoe specialists. These are obligate mistletoe specialists that they only feed on mistletoe. Our flagship species is the painted honeyeater. Removal of mistletoe from trees and clearing of their native habitat is a huge reason for their decline. These guys are also really important because the painted honeyeater and the mistletoe bird are the key dispersers of mistletoe in Australia. Okay, our second last is the seed-eating parrots. So our key flagship species here is the red-tailed black cockatoo. Again, removal of key habitat tree for breeding is a huge reason for decline. There's also far less seed production after severe fires, which we obviously saw in 2019. And they're long-lived and they have a really slow recruitment rate. So a lot of these birds will have, a lot of the smaller birds will have a large clutch of eggs, and they can breed twice a year. What you see with these large birds, seed-eating parrots and raptors, is that they have a lot slower recruitment into the population. So it takes them a lot longer to bounce back from, a really devastating bushfire and huge losses in their population. And finally, the nocturnal predators. So nocturnal predators are a tricky one because they occur at low densities. Our flagship species is the barking owl. These guys are quite stable in their northern range, but we are seeing a big decline in these guys in their southern range. Again, this is largely due to land clearing. Because they are a top vertebrate predator, they rely on having a really healthy ecosystem where they have plenty of prey availability. And each time you have less and less habitat, you have less high quality habitat, less prey for these guys, and another species that has really slow, it really takes them a long time to repopulate. We don't know a lot about this species, but research suggests that they are quite sedentary. So during the bushfires, it's likely that a lot of them didn't abandon their territories and subsequently either haven't had much success breeding or perished with the fires. These guys are also nest hollow dependent, so if there isn't mature woodland around, they can't successfully breed. And there are instances of nest predation from goannas. Also, these guys get really heavily harassed by not just noisy miners, but a whole suite of birds. I saw one male temporarily blinded by a woolly wagtail for a few days. So when you have increased fragmentation, there's an increased risk for these guys to be heavily harassed as well. Okay, so I've got a slide here about threats. I think we just covered a lot of those in our in the Woodland CAP scope species. I think all of those we've talked about. I guess the other one that I would like to speak a little bit more about is dieback. So what we are seeing in a lot of our temperate woodlands is, especially in things like grey box, you'll notice that the trees are dropping all of their leaves. And what is one of the proposed theories for that is that we don't have all of these forest gleaners removing all the lerp and the parasites, because they've been outcompeted by species like the noisy miner. When those birds are absent from the ecosystem, what happens is this disease, these parasites and the lerp, it all goes unchecked, and then we have all of these sick and dying trees. We also saw a lot of dieback and tree death during the drought. So we had all this dieback, and then we had bushfire run through it, and what we're dealing with right now is quite a stark situation, and it just makes having to save what we have left that much more important. So the Woodland CAP came up with 10 management interventions. They were to protect priority areas and engage the wider community, regulate the loss of habitat, fire management, manage total grazing pressure, noisy miner control, manage for extreme weather, expand nectar feeding areas, restore and revegetate, and undertake targeted surveys. So while the CAP was developed by BirdLife, it was designed to be an integrated approach. So BirdLife is mostly focusing on the 5 that are in bold there, which is protecting priority areas and engaging the wider community, regulating the loss of habitat through lobbying, noisy miner control, and restoring and revegetating habitat. Some of these are obviously outside the scope of what BirdLife can achieve. For example, fire management needs to be employed by landowners and by national parks. But what we are trying to do for the ones that we don't take on ourselves is working with these organisations to develop a plan that is basically the best foot forward for birds. So our CAP focus for 21 to 2023 and in the next 24 months, what we'll be focusing on, as I said, is protecting priority areas and engaging the community, trying to regulate habitat loss by lobbying the government, lobbying national parks, and also working with landowners to restore and revegetate degraded areas. And what we've done is we've established working groups that have identified our current projects and our communications plan. And what we're doing is standardising a monitoring and reporting framework that can be used by multiple organisations. So one way that we're assisting in regenerating habitat is the Birds on Farm program. So the Birds on Farm program is occurring in southern New South Wales and northern Victoria at the moment. The idea of it was to strengthen community capacity to identify and monitor priority areas, particularly on private land. So what we wanted to do was raise awareness about conservation on private land and the importance of preserving habitat on private land. And how we did that was we identified key areas used for breeding and feeding and even movement throughout the landscape. And then we got in touch with farmers and, tried to encourage them to adopt a voluntary conservation agreement with us. Now, why is this important? So the Regent Honeyeater, for example, 65% of all records from in the past decade have come from private land. So you can just see on the map there, these are all of our Regent Honeyeater sightings from 2000 to 2009, and the green is major reserves, so your national parks. But what we've seen is most of these have actually come from outside of, environmental reserves and have been on private land instead. And a similar trend for another threatened species, the grey-crowned babbler. If you're living in Queensland, that might be a bit of a shock, but down here they're threatened. And 70% of all records historically come from private land. And one of the conservation tools that we are using is pest management. So managing introduced pests and other pest animals, and also managing our native birds that, while historically have always been here, they're now proliferating to a level where they would not have historically been, and that's largely due to us fragmenting the landscape and allowing them to colonise all of this edge area. So one of the things we do is we assist with the government and private landowners in removing these birds. Often this is done in a controlled manner, but the best way to discourage having noisy miners or Indian miners in your backyard is actually to, where possible, allow ground cover. So sites with an understory are 78% less likely to have large numbers of noisy miners in the area. So by not overgrazing and not clearing all of the understory where possible and safe, you can actually just discourage these guys from even colonising an area. Another one of our conservation tools that we're really excited about and really proud of is our mistletoe propagation work that's mostly been occurring in the Hunter at the moment. So mistletoe gets killed when it's burnt. It doesn't regenerate. So what we had after the 2019 fires was we had large areas of forest where all of the mistletoe had been severely burnt or completely removed from the forest. And these are key structures for a lot of temperate woodland birds, either for feeding in or for nesting in. I've had birds as large as little eagles building nests in mistletoe. So they're really important, both from a food perspective, but also from a shelter and nest building perspective. And most of the heavy lifting on mistletoe propagation is done by the mistletoe bird, but the painted honeyeater also helps in the regeneration of mistletoe. Due to these bushfires we had that were just, like nothing we'd ever seen, we decided that we could help boost the process by manually planting mistletoe and assisting these mistletoe birds with the heavy lifting. And we did this by adopting a program that had been tested in Melbourne, where they were planting native mistletoe in non-native trees to try and improve, the habitat for birds in urban areas. So the area where we were working was the Temperate woodlands. As you can see, all of this area in red was burnt by bushfires in successive years. So from 2015 to 2018, there was several serious bushfires, and it almost completely killed off all the mistletoe in the area. You can see all of these yellow dots. These are all Regent Honeyeater sightings. So this is a really key area for a lot of these birds. And what we wanted to do was to put that key food resource back into the environment for the Regent Honeyeaters. And indeed, this year we had Regent Honeyeaters build a nest in a mistletoe again in a spotted gum. So it is a really key, it's a really key resource for them in terms of their diet, but it's also a key nest building site for them. So what we did was we had some extremely talented arborists come out with us, and what the arborists were doing was transplanting seeds back into previously burnt spotted gum ironbark forest where we knew regents had historically nested. Basically, these guys climb up a tree with a bunch of mistletoe seeds and they squirt them onto the side of the tree. And then we would come back after a few months and monitor to see how many had taken hold. We planted over 1,000 seeds. At this point, we're only sitting at about 9% actually, starting to grow, but we don't know the natural rate for these, so this could actually be quite a good number. We also assist in the Regent Honeyeater monitoring program. So we do a lot of monitoring for Regent Honeyeaters across the state through the funding that we receive from the National Land Care Program. We also work with the help of ANU to deliver the National Regent Honeyeater Monitoring Program, and that is, hundreds of sites that we monitor every year. Twice a year, we're out there looking for these birds, and this happens across the state. So we have a lot of key sites up in the Bundarra-Barraba region. We also have sites around the Lower Hunter and in Capertee and Glen Davis. And then we also have sites further down and, going into Chiltern Mount Pilot National Park in Victoria. So one of the really amazing things that I got to be a part of last year, and if you tune in a few weeks, you can hear all about this amazing release. We did a Regent Honeyeater captive release in the Lower Hunter last year, where 58 captive bred Regent Honeyeaters were released into the Curry Cessnock woodlands. 29 of those birds were fitted with a transmitter, and we were able to track them for several months. And indeed, 4 months later, we had really high survivability, and a lot of these birds were breeding and roosting with wild Regent Honeyeaters. So we had what appeared to be really great integration into the natural system. So what we found when we released these birds was that the birds paired up almost immediately and began attempting to breed. We had 51 nest attempts, and 2 pairs attempted to breed 6 times within the breeding season. 1 pair bred successfully, and we had a wild fledgling that they produced, and that wild fledgling was seen several months later. It is important to note that at the same time that these birds were experiencing nest failure, the wild birds were also experiencing a lot of nest failure. Unfortunately, during the release, a lot of you would remember end of last year, we had a lot of rain, and these guys were really struggling with the weather, just like the rest of us were. But all in all, we had really low mortality and a lot of site fidelity. So it was a very successful release. One of the biggest things that we do as an organisation is advocacy. So it's really important, in order for us to conserve birds, we need to raise awareness and get the public to care. So on this slide, there's just a couple of things. We have signage that, again, working with the National Land Care Program, a lot of the areas where we've established key habitat for certain species, we're putting up signs like these that say, this area is really important for a key species. People need to consider that. So a lot of these are in TSRs. We also have, beautiful signage in wetland centres, and we just have ways of raising awareness, the things that people might not have necessarily thought about. Obviously, we were really lucky. We were able to, Mick, who's here tonight, will be able to talk to you about this in a few weeks, but he did this amazing segment with the project, obviously on the importance of saving some of these critically endangered species. You can see below here a beautiful mural that was painted on a gin distillery in the Hunter Valley. So people can be sitting and doing a wine tasting and a wine tour and looking at these beautiful birds. And there's an established bird walking route that was set up around to case people wanted to do that from a tourism point of view. And then another thing that we do a lot of is obviously radio interviews and magazine articles, but a lot of brochures as well. So there's a brochure down here and breaking down the myths around mistletoe. We do a lot of ID guides and woodland bird guides that people can take bushwalking with them. And if anyone's interested in those, please reach out to us. It's really good to have that in your little pocket, and it's not as heavy as a traditional thick bird guide. We also have advocacy programs set up for some of our key species. So one of our advocacy programs to save our Swifties, and what that is obviously if you go to one of these web links, we've got workshops on how to identify these species, brochures you can print out that will give you an ID guide. And we've also got an email set up where you can compose an email to either your local or your state MP about, you know, how they can act through legislation to save these species. And there's an option to type your own message, or you can, there's a preloaded message that you can also integrate in, because the more voices we have lobbying for these birds, the more likely it is that even a local or a state MP is going to get behind protecting these birds as well. As I said earlier, another really important thing for us is education. So we ran a two-way knowledge sharing workshop on Wanneroo country this year. And what happened was we had the Wanneroo elders, the Mindereva local Aboriginal Land Council, Indigenous Rangers, government agency staff, land care, BirdLife, landholders. We all got together and we shared the information we had on mistletoe propagation and how it could improve the landscape. And we were really lucky that the Wanneroo elders and the Land Council, they shared a lot of information they had about land management practices, you know, knowledge of this country that has been passed down that, you know, we might not be aware of. And also the cultural significance of this land, not just the, I guess, the, you know, the more, I guess, what we would consider tangible value of the land. We also learned about the significance in culture. And it's really important that we have these workshops, and especially ones like this, where it's a two-way sharing of knowledge, because, you know, when you engage with stakeholders who might have a different view to, you know, your individual chamber, there's so much that you can learn from each other. And it was really amazing to be involved in that. And this one is, this one's a big one, and Mick will probably talk again if you tune in a few more weeks. We do a lot of work in trying to save lands through lobbying. So the Hunter Economic Zone has long been a contentious issue, because it's probably the largest chunk of woodland that is, I guess, the most significant breeding site for Regent Honeyeaters in New South Wales. And it was rezoned for development, but thanks to tireless work from multiple conservation agencies, this area has remained largely undeveloped. And the Cessnock City Council is on the verge of saying, you know what, you can have it as an environmental zone, but they need taxpayers to say, that's what we want for this woodland. We don't want it pushed down. We don't want it developed. We want this to stay an environmental area. And that's, again, it's very similar to the Swifties page. There's a link here where you can contact a councillor and say, we really don't want this land developed. And so much of what we do relies on everybody to advocate for it. Otherwise, it's just the same 6 people harassing the Cessnock City Council every week. So I just wanted to acknowledge there were a lot of partners involved with the CAP and developing it, lots of different universities, as well as the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, obviously DPIE in New South Wales. We had lots of land care groups and local land services involved, as well as several conservation groups. So it really was a variety of stakeholders that came together to develop the CAP. And within the Woodland Bird Program, we've also got some other stakeholders here. So Minna River, Taronga Zoo, who assisted us in the captive breeding program, the Victoria and New South Wales state government, and several universities as well. So that's about all on that one for me, guys. And thank you so much for listening. It's great to have so many people engaged.
Thanks, Candice. That's sort of wonderful and hugely appreciated. Now, the very best part of emceeing these events is that I get to ask the first couple of questions. Many of our members, I guess, pride themselves on being amateur naturalists of one sort or another, and we're all used to the sort of taxonomic anarchy that characterises botany, with changing names all the time. I did notice for a number of your key species, you referred to southern and eastern and western versions, and I'm just wondering, is this actually recent genetic work which is starting to split some of these species, let's say the white-browed babbler, or is this more a matter of breaking them into areas of interest, or geographic sort of areas?
Yeah, I'm not sure how they arrived at that. I suspect it's because their population is fragmented in some areas over others. For example, the barking owl is, as I said earlier, is very abundant in its northern range, but the southern barking owl is threatened and declining. I'd also say that Mick might have a better answer for this, but some of these might be subspecies.
Yeah, that's right. So what BirdLife likes to do is actually assign common names to subspecies of birds, just so that the bird actually has an identity. So a good example might be the ground parrot. For a long time has had two subspecies. Rather than saying, oh, the western subspecies of the ground parrot, we're calling them the western ground parrot and the eastern ground parrot. So yeah, so it is literally just giving a name to the subspecies that have been recognised. Mostly the subspecies have been recognised for a long time. It's taxonomic work that has taken place in the past. It's just that BirdLife like to give them an identity with a common name. Yeah.
Okay, no, thanks for that. And look, the second question I just wanted to kick off with was, in your nectivores, you sort of highlighted Swift parrot. We had the strange situation just before the pandemic, so I guess 2019, where large numbers, several dozen Swift parrots sort of turned up in Mount Annan, which is, effectively the middle of the actual metropolitan sort of base of Sydney. And I guess the question that sort of raises in my mind is that difference between rarity and visibility is one thing, but also whether it's telling us something about the importance of remnant vegetation and in fact restored vegetation, because in this case the Swift parrots were absolutely hooking into the lerps in the Cumberland Plain woodland that was being regenerated on the site. So, it gave the impression that this was a relatively abundant species when that's clearly not the case. But there they are in the middle of the city.
Yeah, I think with these guys, obviously, when we see Swift parrots up here, this is only wintering habitat for them. So they're just going where there are really abundant, food resources. Obviously, they head back down to Tasmania to breed. But if there's really abundant food resources for them in Sydney and there's plenty of trees about, it would make sense that a large foraging flock might be all seen at once. And I think in Victoria this year we had reports of 200 birds being seen at once, which gives this impression. It's very similar with fruit bats. People see a large cohort of fruit bats and they go, oh, they can't be endangered. I saw thousands of them, but the space between the next lot of thousands of them is it's actually quite big.
Yeah. I think there was a question from Roger about CWD, and I think Nick was going to provide an answer on that one.
Yeah, I think he has there. So it's coarse woody debris.
Right.
So a lot of that coarse woody debris on the ground, it'll have plenty of insects crawling in and around it, and you might have the urge to clear it up, but in doing so, you're removing a lot of that habitat for them. And then, you know, no insects, you don't have a lot of these pouncing robins and ground foragers.
Yeah. And Lynn's asked a question about mistletoe, and I've got to say I'm glad she asked the question, because I just had this disturbing image of whether or not the arborists were using the authentic means to deposit the seeds on various limbs up in the tree. So she's asked whether there's been any trials of using drones to facilitate mistletoe propagation.
I don't believe so. The work that we're doing is pretty new. So I think it would be extremely challenging, because even when we're targeted and we're smearing the mistletoe on the side of the tree, certain areas of the tree, it's not growing very well. So, for example, if it lands on an area of the tree where the tree's about to shed bark, the tree might shed the bark and shed the mistletoe as well. So we're actually trying to be a bit more strategic about it, and I think it would be hard to do with a drone, but that's not necessarily to say that it can't be done. No, to my knowledge, nothing has been done yet.
Yeah, so the way that seeds are planted from a mistletoe is, so mistletoe fruit is very soft, and the seed is inside. And what happens when the bird eats the fruit? So mistletoe birds actually lack a gizzard. They are missing an organ that we all have. So they don't have a gizzard. So the seed passes through the digestive system of a mistletoe bird in about 20 minutes. It's really rapid. And when it comes out the other end, it is so sticky, the mistletoe bird literally has to really wipe to get it off. And so a drone wouldn't work, because it, like Candice said, even the arborists have a hard time getting the really sticky seed off their fingers. I mean, it actually is very handy, because we know that once you've wiped it off your finger, it is deposited. It's not going anywhere. It could rain for a month, and that seed would stay in place, because it is so sticky. So yeah, I don't think a drone would actually work for mistletoe.
Question, a sort of a broader question about habitat augmentation from Joan, who's asking about nest box installation in areas impacted by fire or dieback, whether that's part of what BirdLife Australia does.
I believe that they are doing. They are putting up nest boxes for cockatoos, and I think you guys do have a webinar coming up with another one of our colleagues from BirdLife about some of the work they're doing to improve cockatoo habitat. Nest boxes are a bit of a tricky one as well, in terms of depends on the species essentially that you're putting the nest box in for. Are they going to use it? Some species really enjoy nest boxes. I know with owls, sometimes they won't use them at all, and it's because the microclimate of the nest box is not the same as the microclimate of a tree hollow. So it definitely does work in some areas, and I mean, they were doing some nest boxes for swift parrots in Tasmania as well, which Mick, you might know a bit more about. But then you also have the risk of predators and things like possums getting into these nest boxes as well. So nest box, I guess putting up nest boxes for birds specifically, it often probably needs to be targeted, and you need to think about the species you're trying to attract with your nest boxes.
Yep. I'm just wondering if you might be able to talk to us a little bit about how BirdLife sort of established the idea of the Conservation Action Plan. And I'm particularly interested in a New South Wales context. Obviously, we've had the opportunity to comment on the current iteration of the Saving Our Species program, and we've sort of watched the debacle that's been the changes to the EPBC, and particularly the sort of stepping right away from recovery planning for species. have you ended up with these conservation action plans because the stuff that the state and federal government are trying to do in the conservation space just isn't working?
Mick, I think you were, like, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, and the NPA was actually represented too. Like Ocean, joined in on that.
Yeah.
So I guess Gary, like you mentioned recovery plans, and essentially what the Woodland Birds CAP is it's a recovery plan for 50 species. So it's trying to address the threats and how we can improve the conservation outcome for a number of species by, we spent a good couple of days in Melbourne thinking about how best to achieve that, and we ended up landing on identifying the iconic groups. And so that's, like Candice walked us through the ground foragers and the bark gleaners and that sort of thing. So, and then within each iconic group, we have a flagship species. So you still it's hard to avoid. The Regent Honeyeater is really a flagship species for woodland birds, and in particular nectarivores. It's hard to avoid having a flagship because you are often trying to save the most endangered or the most iconic of a group. And I still think that's the most effective way of doing it. But to get back to your point about it potentially addressing the shortcomings of recovery planning, I think yes, because this isn't enshrined in legislation. So I guess, with having this plan, we're able to go out to groups such as LLS, land care groups, and whoever, and the messaging is pretty simple. The objectives are pretty straightforward, and it's much easier to get things done, I think. Our groups are NGOs. We can implement things a lot easier than recovery plans, which tend to get sort of caught up in legislation and red tape. So it's still very much in the pre-implementation phase, I guess, but it's really laid a lot of groundwork for where we go next.
Yeah, I've got to say, I find it an incredibly encouraging model, in part because you're dealing with habitats and looking for opportunities where habitat protection sort of maximises outcome in species terms, but also because the whole recovery planning process has not fared well under recent governments. I mean, we only have to look at the changes to the Swift Parrot recovery plan sort of 3 or 4 years ago now, where, logging of habitat trees in Tasmania was removed as a threatening process under that recovery plan. It's just bizarre. And that's just the politics of it. Look, we're coming very quickly to the end of our time. I guess one of the question I can't help but ask of BirdLife is that, one of your flagship citizen science projects has obviously been the regular atlases. And is there another atlas coming? And will there be another invitation for citizens to participate in the atlas surveys?
I'll answer that one, Candice, if you like. The short answer is no. So okay. Well, I guess the first 2 atlases, they occurred in an era sort of before we were able to do bird surveys with a phone in our hand and record them in real time. So we needed to really coordinate Australia-wide atlas bird surveys, which ran over several years and were enormous. And hats off to the guys that actually led that at the time. Amazing work. So now that the focus is more on the fact that we are able to enter the data in real time, so we're more focusing on trying to get people to do systematic surveys. And there was a question in the chat earlier about eBird. So eBird is a very popular app for people to record more bird lists than surveys. So eBird data does actually get shared with bird data. But we try and encourage eBird users to try and conform as much as they can to our survey protocols, because that gives us more scientific, robustness. So so I guess there's no immediate or even potentially medium-term plans to do another atlas. It's more real time because we're able to.
So Nick, I'm going to interpret that as it's actually a continuous ongoing thing rather than an episodic sort of survey now. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, there's a lot of people out there like myself, you know, I probably average 3 or 4 bird data lists or surveys a day. You know, like I'm a birder, so and I work in the field, but there's a lot of people out there, particularly you know, bird watchers and members of bird clubs, and you know, your members that are out and about. And I often say that birds are probably, you know, birds and plants, they are the 2 sort of easiest things that you can record. If you send people off to record microbats or frogs, it's a little bit more challenging, but birds are diurnal generally, and they're in every habitat. So they are actually a really easy thing that us as citizen scientists can actually contribute towards. Yeah.
All right. Well, look, I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much for your presentations tonight. Really appreciate it. And I've got to say, looking forward immensely to the next webinars from BirdLife Australia. Thanks, everybody. Hope you enjoyed yourself, and see you soon.